The engine cut, the door swung open, and in the 5 seconds it took Meredith Holt to plant her first heel on someone else's grass, the ground beneath her $60,000 investment had already begun to drink. Callista Verne had lived on Birchwood Court for 11 years without a single complaint filed against her. She paid her HOA dues on time, kept her hedges trimmed to regulation height, repainted her shutters the approved shade of colonial gray, Sherwin-Williams 7017, not a drop darker, and had never once allowed a weed to survive longer than 48 hours in her front beds. She was the kind of neighbor who returned shopping carts, waved at strangers, and left holiday cards in every mailbox on the block without expecting anything in return. She was, by every reasonable measure, exactly the kind of resident an HOA should have wanted. But Meredith Holt did not want neighbors, she wanted subjects. Meredith had been elected HOA president 3 years ago in a vote that drew only 11 participants, 7 of whom were her personal friends from the Thursday book club she'd co-opted into a de facto political machine. Since then, she had redesigned the neighborhood's violation notification system to route all complaints directly through her personal email, revised the fine schedule twice without a proper board vote, and had a custom placard installed at the neighborhood entrance that read, "Birchwood Court, a community of standards," with her name printed on the lower right corner in a font size that suggested authorship rather than mere administration. Callista had tolerated her, most of the block had. You tolerated weather, you tolerated traffic, you tolerated Meredith Holt. The trouble that would eventually swallow a $100,000 SUV began, as most neighborhood catastrophes do, with something small. It began with a garden. Callista had decided in early April to install a rain garden along the eastern edge of her front lawn, a shallow bowl-shaped depression planted with native grasses and sedges, designed to absorb stormwater runoff from her driveway. She had researched it for months. She had consulted with a landscape architect named Dex Farrow, who specialized in residential water management and had worked on 3 similar installations in the county. She had pulled the appropriate municipal permits. She had even submitted a written proposal to the HOA's Architectural Review Committee, a committee, she later learned, that had not met in 14 months because Meredith preferred to handle approvals informally, meaning personally, meaning unilaterally. She received no response within the 30-day window required by the HOA's own bylaws. She took that silence, correctly under those same bylaws, as implicit approval, and she broke ground on a Thursday morning in late April. Dex's crew was professional and efficient. They excavated a shallow basin roughly 18 feet long and 4 feet wide along the edge of the lawn, lined the bottom with a 6-inch layer of amended soil and sand for percolation, planted plugs of blue flag iris, soft rush, and swamp milkweed, and finished the edges with river stone. By Friday afternoon, it looked less like a construction site and more like something from a garden magazine: intentional, elegant, quietly purposeful. By Saturday morning, Meredith Holt had photographed it from the street, from both angles, and from what appeared to be a crouched position near Callista's mailbox. Callista watched from her front window with a coffee mug in both hands, not yet alarmed, only curious in the particular way you are curious about something you already half understand. The violation notice arrived the following Tuesday. It cited 3 separate sections of the HOA's Community Standards document, sections 4.2, 7.1, and a subsection labeled 12B that Callista could not locate in any version of the document she possessed, including the one posted on the HOA's website. The violation accused her of installing an unauthorized landscape modification, creating a potential drainage hazard to adjacent properties, and, the one that stung, deliberate circumvention of the architectural review process. The fine was $450, payable within 15 days. Callista set the letter on her kitchen table and read it 3 times. Then she called her neighbor, a retired civil engineer named Aldous Price, who lived 2 houses down and had been on Birchwood Court longer than anyone else. Aldous was 71, slow-moving, with a deliberate manner of speech that made him sound wise even when he was just being accurate. He came over that afternoon, read the letter, looked at the rain garden, and said very quietly, "She didn't like that you went around her." "I didn't go around her, I followed the process." "You followed the process correctly," Aldous said. "That's the same thing to her." Callista appealed the fine in writing. She attached a copy of the submitted proposal with its original timestamp, the municipal permit, a photograph of the completed installation, a letter from Dex Farrow describing the hydrological function of the garden, and a highlighted excerpt from the HOA bylaws specifying the 30-day default approval rule. The appeal was denied, no reason was given. She then requested a formal hearing before the full board. This right was also guaranteed by the bylaws. Meredith scheduled the hearing for 6 weeks out, the maximum permissible delay, and set it for a Wednesday at 2 p.m., a time when, as Callista noted, the majority of working residents could not attend. Callista attended. She brought Aldous. She brought a folder 3 inches thick. The board meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a beige room that smelled of old carpet and canned air. Meredith sat at the head of a folding table flanked by 2 other board members, a man named Terrence who seemed primarily interested in his own phone, and a woman named Gail who appeared to have recently been crying about something unrelated to HOA business. Meredith wore a blazer. She had printed an agenda. She called the meeting to order and smiled at Callista in the way people smile at problems they believe they have already solved. Callista presented her case methodically. She spoke for 9 minutes. She referenced the bylaws by section number. She offered Dex Farrow's letter and explained in plain language how a rain garden functions, that it directs water downward not outward, and actually reduces runoff to adjacent properties rather than increasing it. She noted that the fine had been issued before the review period for her appeal had technically expired, which was itself a violation of HOA procedure. Meredith listened with her hands folded on the table and an expression of patient condescension that she had clearly practiced. When Callista finished, Meredith said, "The board appreciates your presentation," in a tone that made the word appreciate into something else entirely. The board voted to uphold the fine. The vote was 2-1, Aldous having no vote, Terrence being the second in favor, and Gail, surprisingly, the one dissent. Gail would not make eye contact with anyone as the vote was recorded. Callista drove home in silence. She sat in her car in the driveway for 4 minutes before going inside. She did not pay the fine. Instead, she found an attorney. His name was Breck Tannehill, a lean, precise man in his early 50s who specialized in community association law and had, in his own words, seen everything. He read her documentation in one sitting and said the case was solid enough to pursue in small claims court, where she could argue procedural violation, improper denial of appeal, and potentially file a counterclaim for the cost of his consultation. He did not use complicated language. He said they broke their own rules. That's usually the fastest way to lose. She filed in small claims court on a Monday in mid-June. The summons arrived at Meredith Holt's door on a Wednesday. Callista did not see the moment it was delivered, but Aldous, who had been trimming his front hedge, reported later that Meredith had opened the envelope at the door, read it standing up, and then stood very still for approximately 30 seconds before going back inside without closing the door behind her. Aldous thought that was interesting. The next morning, Callista woke at 6:15 to the sound of a car on her lawn. Not near her lawn, not at the curb, on her lawn. She heard the soft crushing of grass, the particular low groan of a heavy vehicle rolling over soil not designed to carry it, and then the distinctive stop, the cut of an engine, followed by a door slamming with the kind of force that was meant to be heard from inside a house. She went to the front window. Meredith Holt's Cadillac Escalade, pearl white, the current year. A vehicle whose sticker price Callista had once overheard Meredith mention casually at a block party in the same breath as her son's acceptance to a private university, was parked on Callista's front lawn. Not partly on the lawn, fully on the lawn. All 4 wheels in the grass, positioned with what appeared to be deliberate precision approximately 8 feet from the sidewalk, almost as if Meredith had measured it. Meredith herself stood beside the driver's door wearing a pressed linen blouse and sunglasses at 6:15 in the morning, her arms crossed. Her posture the posture of someone who had already composed the story they would tell about this day. Callista opened her front door. "What are you doing?" she asked. Her voice was controlled. She had the lawsuit pending. She had a lawyer. She knew that whatever happened in the next 60 seconds would either help or hurt her position, and she chose help. Parking, Meredith said. "On my lawn. There's no signage prohibiting it." Callista looked at the Escalade. She looked at the lawn. She looked at the shallow diagonal crease in the grass where the tires had rolled. Then she looked at the rain garden at the eastern edge of the lawn, approximately 12 feet from where Meredith had parked, and she noticed something that Meredith had either not considered or had genuinely not known. The installation of the rain garden had fundamentally altered the hydrology of that section of the yard. 6 weeks of spring rain and 2 significant storms had worked through the new soil layers exactly as Dex had designed, creating a broad underground zone of saturation that extended several feet in every direction from the basin. The surface grass looked the same. The topsoil felt the same if you pressed it with a shoe. But beneath it, beneath the first 4 inches of sod and roots, the soil was holding water the way a sponge holds water when it has been thoroughly and recently soaked. Callista had known this. She had been watching the percolation with interest since the last storm 3 days earlier. Meredith had parked a 6,000-pound vehicle on top of it. "I'm going to have to ask you to move your car," Callista said. "Or what?" "Or I'll call a tow truck and add the cost to my filing." Meredith smiled. It was a smile designed to communicate something about power. "You do that," she said. "I'll stand here and watch. This is a public." She didn't finish the sentence. The right rear tire went first. There was no dramatic sound, no crack, no collapse, nothing cinematic. It was quieter than that. It was the sound of the earth accepting something, a slow exhalation, a giving way. The tire sank perhaps 4 inches in the span of 2 seconds. Then the vehicle tilted. Then the left rear followed, and suddenly the entire back end of the Escalade had dropped 6 inches into the lawn and the front end had tipped upward in response, as if the car were beginning a bow. Meredith grabbed her door handle. It was a reflex. The door was still closed. "What?" she said. The sinking slowed but did not stop. The saturated soil was redistributing under the weight, spreading outward and downward in channels between the layers, and the vehicle continued its gradual, unstoppable descent. By the time 15 seconds had passed, the rear axle was nearly at ground level, the undercarriage was in contact with the soil, and the car had settled into a posture that made it look less like a parked vehicle, and more like an animal that had lain down and decided not to get up. Meredith stood at the driver's door and said nothing. Her sunglasses had been pushed up by the hand she'd raised to her face. She was looking at her car the way you look at something you cannot immediately classify because your brain is waiting for it to make sense and it is refusing to do so. Callista watched from the doorway. She said nothing, she simply watched. Then she took out her phone and she started filming. The first person to arrive after Callista called was not the tow truck. It was Aldous, who had apparently been watching from his window. He admitted this without embarrassment, and who crossed the street in his canvas garden shoes with the deliberate calm of a man arriving at something he had been expecting. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at the Escalade with the same expression he used when evaluating foundation cracks, clinical, interested, already composing a diagnosis. "Saturation depth," he said to Callista. "That's what I thought. She's sitting on top of what might be 8–10 inches of waterlogged substrate. Dex built that thing properly. The soil layers are holding like a reservoir down there." Meredith had been on her phone since the car stopped moving. She had called someone, possibly her husband, possibly a dealership, possibly anyone who would answer at 6:30 in the morning, and was speaking in a low, urgent voice with her back to both of them. Her heels had sunk slightly into the wet grass near the vehicle. The tow truck arrived 40 minutes later. The driver, a broad-shouldered man named Garrett who wore a company shirt with the sleeves cut off at the shoulder, walked twice around the Escalade before he said anything. Then he crouched beside the rear wheel well and looked underneath the vehicle and made a sound that was not quite a word, but communicated something clear about the degree of difficulty. "She's sitting on her frame," he said. "Rear axle is fully below grade. I can't pull straight back without risking the undercarriage, going to need a second truck and rigging from the front." Meredith said, "How long?" "Hour and a half, maybe 2. She stopped, started again. "This is insane, can't you just—" "Ma'am, I've been doing this 20 years, I'm telling you what it needs." He said it without unkindness and without any particular interest in her reaction. He walked back to his truck and made a call. Neighbors had begun appearing by then. Not all at once, not in a crowd, but one at a time, the way people drift towards something when they sense that it is significant. A woman named Preethi from across the street who had been leaving for work and then simply didn't. A young man named Cole who lived in the rental 3 doors down and who filmed for approximately 40 seconds before Meredith noticed, and he put his phone away. An older couple named the Souzas who appeared in their front garden, ostensibly weeding, and did not move from that position for an hour. Callista went inside and made coffee. She brought a cup to Aldous, who accepted it without looking away from the Escalade. She kept her phone in her pocket with the video already saved. By 8:15, the second tow truck had arrived. By 8:40, they had secured rigging at both ends and established what Garrett called a controlled extraction protocol, which meant that they moved the vehicle at a pace slow enough to be almost imperceptible. The Escalade emerged from the depression it had created in stages, and when it was finally clear of the lawn and sitting on the street, the damage beneath it was plainly visible. A pit roughly 2 feet deep at its lowest point, the edges sheared clean by the frame river stone from the rain garden scattered in a wide arc, 3 of the iris plantings crushed, the soil layers exposed in cross-section like a geological sample. The vehicle itself, once upright on solid pavement, appeared outwardly intact, but Garrett walked around it slowly, crouching twice, and when he stood up the last time he said, "Frame may be stressed, you'll want a structural inspection before you drive this." He paused, "And the undercarriage has damage, I can see it from here." He said that last part to Meredith specifically, and she looked at the car for a long moment without responding. The cost of the extraction, Garrett told her, was $620. He said it matter-of-factly, already filling out paperwork on a clipboard. Meredith paid it with a card she removed from her wallet with a hand that was not entirely steady. Callista took photographs of the damaged lawn. She took photographs of the pit. She took a video that panned from the tire tracks at the sidewalk to the excavated basin, establishing the trajectory of the vehicle. Then she called Breck Tannehill and left him a message that lasted less than 30 seconds and ended with, "I have footage. She came onto my property this morning. I need to know what this changes." Breck called back inside 2 hours. His voice had the particular quality it got when he was pleased in a professional way. He used phrases like willful trespass, property damage, and escalation of harassment pattern. He used the phrase "this considerably strengthens" twice. He told her to preserve all recordings, document the damage with a licensed contractor's estimate, and send him everything by end of day. Meredith's car was towed to a dealership. The structural inspection, Callista would later learn from Aldous, who had spoken to the Sousas, who had a cousin who worked at the same dealership, revealed a bent rear subframe. The repair estimate was $19,000. Her insurance filed it as a non-collision claim. The adjuster asked her to describe how the damage occurred. She apparently said she had parked on a neighbor's lawn and the vehicle had sunk into a drainage feature. The adjuster asked whether she'd had permission to park there. There was a pause in the call, then she said no. The claim was flagged for review. That afternoon, Callista had Dex Farrow out to assess the damage to the rain garden. He walked the pit methodically, took measurements, photographed the exposed soil layers with the precise interest of someone who had designed the thing, and felt a professional affront at seeing it excavated by a Cadillac. He estimated restoration costs at $2,200, including replanting, amended soil replacement, and relaying the river stone. He provided a written estimate the same day. Callista added the estimate to her filing. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table with Aldous and a neighbor named Simone, a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-40s who taught constitutional law at the state university and had been on Birchwood Court for 4 years. And the three of them went through the documentation the way you go through a case you know you're going to win, not rushing it, just making sure it's airtight. "She drove onto your property the morning after receiving a court summons," Simone said, turning a page. "That's going to read as retaliation." "That's what Breck said." "Breck's right," she set the paper down. "She handed this to you." Aldous, who had been quiet for several minutes, said, "The remarkable thing is that she thought it would intimidate you." Callista looked at him. "She's been doing this a long time," he said, "filing notices, denying appeals, controlling process, and when that didn't work she tried something physical, something visible." He paused. "She didn't account for the ground." Callista almost smiled. "No," she said, "she didn't." Outside, the front lawn was quiet. The pit from the vehicle sat uncovered, raw and open, the damaged iris plants laid to one side where Dex had moved them for later restoration. The river stone was scattered across the grass in a wide ellipse, pale gray against the darker turf, catching the last flat light of the evening. It looked in a particular way like evidence, because it was. And somewhere across the neighborhood, in a house with a placard on the wall that read "Community of Standards," Meredith Holt was on the phone with her insurance company again, learning something about what happens when you use the weight of your position to park somewhere you were never permitted to be. The ground, it turned out, remembered. The court date was set for a Thursday in late July, and Breck Tannehill had spent the intervening weeks building the kind of case that expands as it is built, each new document pulling another thread, each thread revealing another structural problem in the HOA's conduct that went well beyond a single rain garden violation. What had begun as a $450 fine dispute had grown into something considerably more serious, and Meredith Holt did not appear to have fully understood that until approximately 10 days before the hearing, when she retained her own attorney, a man named Clifford Marsh who specialized in community association defense and who, according to Breck, had a reputation for settling early when the opposing documentation was strong. Clifford reached out the week before the hearing. Breck reported the conversation to Callista in a phone call that lasted 12 minutes and had the organized quality of a briefing. Clifford had proposed a settlement, full dismissal of the fine, reimbursement of Callista's legal costs, and restoration of the rain garden at the HOA's expense. In exchange, Callista would agree not to pursue the trespass and property damage claims separately. Callista listened to all of this, then said, "No." Breck paused. "You want to think about it?" "I've thought about it, no. The settlement is financially favorable. I know I still want to go." There was a brief silence, then Breck said, "Okay," and she could hear that he was not displeased. The hearing was held in a courtroom that was smaller than Callista had imagined, a single-story annex of the county courthouse with fluorescent lighting. A judge named the Honorable Petra Van, who had the efficient manner of someone who had heard every version of every neighborhood dispute, and had stopped finding any of them surprising. Meredith arrived with Clifford Marsh, wearing a charcoal blazer and the particular expression of someone who had decided that composure was a form of argument. Terrence from the HOA board sat in the gallery. Gale did not appear. Breck presented the case in sequence. He began with the original proposal, the rain garden submission, the timestamp, the bylaws provision requiring response within 30 days. He showed the permit documentation. He presented Dex Farrow's technical letter. He walked through the violation notice, the improper appeal denial, the scheduling of the board hearing at a time that systematically excluded working residents. He then moved to the morning of the escalade, presenting Callista's footage, 18 seconds of video showing the vehicle rolling onto the lawn, stopping, and then beginning its slow subsidence into the saturated soil, followed by the photographs, the tow truck invoice, Dex Farrow's restoration estimate, and Garrett's notes from the extraction, which included a handwritten observation about undercarriage contact with the subgrade. Judge Van watched the video twice. She did not comment on it. She asked Clifford Marsh to respond. Clifford had clearly prepared for a version of this case that was less complete than the one Breck had presented. He argued that the HOA had a legitimate interest in reviewing landscape modifications, that the violation notice had been issued in good faith, and that the vehicle incident was a private matter unrelated to the HOA's conduct. He used the phrase "good faith" 4 times. Judge Van wrote something down each time he said it. She did not ask him to explain what good faith meant in the context of parking a vehicle on a private lawn the morning after receiving a court summons. She asked Meredith one question directly. She said, "Did you drive your vehicle onto the plaintiff's property on the morning in question?" Meredith looked at Clifford. Clifford gave a small, barely perceptible nod. "Yes," Meredith said. "Did the plaintiff give you permission to do so?" "No." Judge Van wrote something else, then she set her pen down and looked at both tables. She found in Callista's favor on every point. She voided the fine with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled. She awarded Callista's legal costs, which were itemized and totaled $2,900. She awarded the rain garden restoration costs of $2,200. And on the trespass and property damage claim, which Clifford had argued was minor, she ruled that the documented damage to the lawn, the irrigation feature, and the demonstrable connection between the vehicle's presence and the HOA's pattern of conduct constituted willful property damage in the context of an ongoing harassment pattern, and she awarded an additional $1,400 in damages. The total award was $6,500, payable by the HOA within 30 days. Clifford Marsh made no visible reaction. Meredith sat very still for approximately 10 seconds, then gathered her folder from the table with careful, deliberate movements, as if she were trying to perform normalcy for an audience that had stopped watching her. Terrence left the gallery before the gavel came down. Callista didn't see him go. She was looking at Judge Van's written order, which Breck had placed in front of her, reading the language that said "voided with prejudice" in clean, printed type. She folded the order once and put it in her bag. Outside the courthouse in the flat midday heat of late July, Breck said, "Well done," and shook her hand. Aldous was waiting in the parking lot. He had driven himself and had refused to come inside, saying courtrooms made his lower back hurt, but he wanted to be available afterward. He looked at Callista's face when she came through the door and said, "Good." "Good," she said. He nodded once and unlocked his car. The consequences for Meredith moved in waves after that. The first was the insurance ruling. Her provider completed its review of the Escalade claim and denied coverage on the basis that the damage had occurred during unauthorized use of private property. The subframe repair, $19,000, was her personal responsibility. She appealed the denial. The appeal was denied. A neighbor named Preethai, who worked in insurance and had followed the story with professional interest, said privately to Simone that the denial was textbook and that Meredith's attorney should have advised her better. The second wave came from within the HOA itself. Gale, the board member who had cast the single dissenting vote at Callista's hearing, circulated a letter to the full HOA membership 3 days after the court ruling. The letter outlined what she called procedural concerns with the board's governance over the past 2 years: the unilateral fine revisions, the informal approval process, the failure to convene the architectural review committee. She cited specific bylaw violations and requested an emergency membership meeting to discuss board conduct. 41 of the 57 households on Birchwood Court signed the request within 4 days. The meeting was held in the clubhouse on the second Tuesday in August. Meredith did not attend. She sent a written statement that Clifford Marsh had clearly drafted, which used the phrase "deeply committed to this community" and offered nothing specific. The membership voted to conduct a formal review of board decisions over the past 30 months. They appointed Aldous, who had declined 3 times and accepted on the 4th request, to chair the review committee. Terrence resigned from the board before the review began. He sent a 4-line email that said nothing in particular. Meredith submitted her resignation as HOA president on a Friday afternoon in late August, in a single-paragraph email that her name was on, but that felt like it had been written by someone else. There were no community announcements, no farewell message, no mention of her name placard at the neighborhood entrance, which was quietly removed sometime during the first week of September. Nobody claimed responsibility for removing it. Nobody asked. Callista had the rain garden restored in early September. Dex Farrow oversaw the work personally. The new soil layers were placed with the same care as the original installation, the iris plugs replaced with specimens from the same nursery, the river stone relayed along the edges in the pattern Callista had originally designed. By the 3rd week of September, after 2 moderate rains, the plantings had taken hold and the surface of the garden was indistinguishable from the surrounding lawn unless you were looking specifically for it. Callista stood in her front yard on an afternoon in late September. The air had the particular quality that arrives in that season, cooler and cleaner, with a low angle of light that turned the grass a shade of gold it never reached in summer. And she looked at the garden, at the restored stone border, at the blue flag iris that would not bloom until spring, but that was already visibly alive. Aldous came out to the sidewalk and stood there. "It looks right," he said. "It does. Better than before, maybe." She considered that. "I think just the same, it just looks more earned." He looked at the garden for another moment, then at the street, then at the neighborhood in general, at the houses and the lawns and the ordinary quiet of a Tuesday afternoon that had nothing dramatic in it. "She thought she was the ground," he said finally. "She thought she was the thing everything else had to give way to." Callista didn't say anything. "Turns out the ground was already there," Aldous said. "Before her, after her." He turned and walked back toward his house, moving slowly in the way he always moved, without urgency, as if time were a material he'd learned not to waste. The ground doesn't really notice the things that sink into it. Callista stayed in the front yard for a while longer. A car passed. A kid on a bicycle crossed at the corner. The iris stems swayed in a brief wind and then settled. 11 years on Birchwood Court, and the thing she felt standing there was not triumph and not relief and not vindication in any clean, satisfying sense. It was simpler than all of that. It was the specific feeling of a thing returned to what it was supposed to be, not restored exactly, because nothing is ever precisely restored, but corrected, re-leveled, set back into alignment with the truth of itself.